Hello and welcome.
Okay, so hello everybody. It's great to see everybody this afternoon, and hopefully the weather is good in Edmonton. Nice balmy 22 here in Syracuse, and Shelley is now here, so it's a nice change. So we're continuing our investigation in Islam, Judaism, to some degree of Christianity as well, and I want to talk a little, well, today I want to talk, in the first hour, we'll begin with just thinking about surface similarities between the three faiths and thinking about why there are more similarities between Judaism and Christianity and different similarities between Judaism and Islam that grew up in a very different kind of way. So Judaism, let's just see what we can come up with. What are some ritual or theological similarities between Judaism and Christianity?
Praying to the east. Praying to the west.
Let me turn you up. I'm not hearing people very well.
Okay.
Okay, now try again, Odette. Now I can hear you.
Okay. Praying towards the east.
Okay, so praying is a similarity. Christians don't necessarily pray towards the east. So that Jews and Muslims pray to the east. So we'll get to that later. But Christians, it's not as required within Christianity. But praying certainly is a similarity. And now we would say is praying is a similarity between all three faiths. Absolutely. So what else are similarities?
Well, there is part of they believe in the old Bible. What do you call it? The old Bible, obviously.
So Christians and Jews accept that what we would call the Hebrew scriptures, Christians would call the Old Testament, our Bible, whatever that means. Bible comes from the Greek word book, and more specifically, we have canonized texts, texts that religious authorities have decided are the Bible. And now, however, we're not totally identical in what we call the Bible. Meaning, now we're not talking about, obviously Jews don't accept the Christian scriptures, but Christian Bible is actually somewhat longer than the Jewish Bible. So in the Christian Bible, they have a group of texts that we call the Apocrypha, which are quite a number of books that we don't accept. Books that are eschatological in nature, meaning visions of God. And then also books like Judith and Tobit that we don't accept. And also the 5 books of Maccabees that Jews don't accept. So there also are parts of Esther that are found in Christian Bibles that we don't accept, and other books as well. So Christian authorities and Jewish authorities probably had very much the same pile of books, and the rabbis who chose what would be in the Hebrew Bible chose a slightly different selection than the Bible that the Christian Bible chose. Sometimes for political reasons, other times for probably aesthetic reasons, but there was a slightly different selection. So the Apocrypha is found, but the Apocrypha is found in Christian Bibles and some Christian Bibles, not all, and also from the Greek as well as the Catholic traditions. The Protestant traditions generally do not accept the Apocrypha. So. And then there were lots of, by the way, in addition, there were lots of other books that nobody accepted. And these books, some of which are talked about in both Christian and Jewish sources, some fragments have remained in places like the Cairo Geniza and in quotations by various Christian and Jewish sources, but many of these have vanished. So there were lots and lots of books of which the Jews and Christians made somewhat similar, but also different selections. Every book that's in the Hebrew Bible is in the Christian Bible, but the other side is not correct. There were, by the way, also lots of gospels that could have been chosen to be included in the New Testament, in the Christian version of the Bible, and their church fathers also made a selection of gospels that would go in there. So there were many texts that were not included by Christians that were specifically Christian as well. So, so there were lots and lots of different texts. Some texts remained important for Jewish reasons, for mystical reasons, and others within both Christian and Jewish Gnostic traditions, meaning secret mystical traditions. But the Bibles essentially, but the Bibles are relatively fixed, are very fixed, and are not identical. But the Christians, however, though the Christians accept the Hebrew scriptures as Bible, it's very clear from Paul on that there's a very strong sense that the Hebrew Bible, what was called the Old Testament, has now been annulled, that it's no longer in force. So essentially, the textual traditions or stories are definitely still important, but the religious laws that are contained in the Torah have been annulled by the presence of Jesus, according to Paul and later Christian sources. So how they read the Bible is very different, though we do share the Bible. Okay, what else do we share?
Well, we both have a Sabbath day.
So,
Okay, Odette, let's wait and we give everybody a chance. So please raise your hand. That way, if we can make sure to spread out the answers. So Louis is absolutely right. We both have a Sabbath day, though, and in early Christianity, the Sabbath day was on Saturday, as it was in Judaism. And then with the Council of Nicaea, in order to separate Christianity and Judaism very specifically, the Christian Sabbath day was moved to Sunday, which was also the day recognized as the day Jesus rose from the dead. So, but the Sabbath day as such was important. Now, in the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, the laws of the Sabbath have largely been abrogated. So there are few laws about rest that were enshrined in the Catholic and Orthodox traditions. However, in many of the Protestant traditions, and of course that's much later, that's from the 15th century and onward, really the early 16th century and onward, then you begin to have a rediscovery of the Sabbath laws, so that the Presbyterians and other Christian groups from the Protestant tradition reinstituted some elements of Sabbath observance, though never to the strictness that was done in Judaism. But the Sabbath is there in both traditions as well. Absolutely. Anything else?
how about different fast days? Like I'm thinking mostly for the Christians, there is the pre-Easter, there is on Lent, Good Friday, there's a fast. It's not similar, obviously, to Yom Kippur, and of course, Jews have many other fast days, but Yom Kippur was the biggest one. I don't know if I should say, but this is more visual, like the egg in Easter, although the egg is not a holy thing, but the egg in Easter, it's not similar to the egg in Passover, but we both have that symbol.
Okay, so there were two different things there, and they're both right. Fasting, now I would say fasting in Christianity is not hugely related, at least causally, to fasts like Yom Kippur. There is no total abstention from food within the normative Christian canon. Though Lent is looked at as a fast, and is more and similar to the period of Sphira that we have between Passover and Yom Kippur, Passover and Shavuot, or the period of Elul leading up to Rosh Hashanah. So it has more in common with those, though I don't know that there's a causal relationship. But in between Judaism and Islam, by the way, fasting is very similar. Although different, fasting is there as a full institution, though different as well. But then Odette turned to more some not necessarily surface similarities, but there are similarities. So in Judaism and Christianity, during Passover or Easter, an egg is an important symbol, or a symbol anyway. Now, an egg was also a very important symbol in Roman times for the spring holidays, because eggs being circular, also being are about rebirth. So so eggs were an important spring symbol throughout the ancient world. So it's not a coincidence that eggs became important both for Passover and for Easter. Now, it's not exactly clear. And eating an egg on Passover is not found in the Talmud. So we don't know exactly how old that is. But it's not unlikely that Jews and Christians chose it for very similar reasons for Passover and for Easter. Okay, any other similarities that people think about? Okay, so let me talk about it then. So between Judaism and Christianity, there actually are enormous similarities, at least initially, and then Christianity went off in a very different direction. So Judaism and Christianity, meaning modern Judaism and modern Christianity and its foundation, women were excluded from leadership. Yeah, I think that's a similarity. It certainly is as well, although it's not clear that women were ever leaders in Second Temple. Actually, that's not totally correct. There were women. We do find in the archaeological record a title of Archis Synagogus that's mentioned with women. So women did run synagogues, though probably they weren't involved in the ritual. So in antiquity, there were women synagogue presidents. In Christianity, early on, women played as much of a role as men in leadership of Christian communities. And it was only as Christianity developed its hierarchy that women were excluded, and then from the major roles of leadership. And then in Christianity, secondary roles were developed, especially with convents and the like for women that were very separate. Though of course there are numerous women saints, which separates it from Judaism in a very big way. Where there are very few women heroes. Although tomorrow I'm going to be teaching in my class I do on Thursdays texts from the Talmud about interest. There's a whole selection of texts about women in leadership and other roles in the Talmud. So there's more than we expect or remember, but still it was limited. But let me turn back now. So if we start back before the 70 CE, there was the temple in Jerusalem. The temple was ruled by the priests. It was structured that the priest would wear ceremonial garb, signifying his ordination by Aaron and descent from Aaron as the one who could offer sacrifices. And the synagogue the temple was created with its center with courtyards where people could stand, and ultimately the inner area, which was limited to the priests, and finally the Holy of Holies, which was limited to the high priest. And in the temple, sacrifices were the primary form of worship. So that if you were Jewish back in the Second Temple period, and you wanted to thank God for something, you might pray, but most people probably wouldn't. Most people would probably take a sacrifice and go to the temple. If you wanted to repent, you wouldn't necessarily go through a whole process of tshuva at home. Instead, you probably would go to the temple and offer a sin offering, or go on the holy days on Yom Kippur, which was not actually the big pilgrimage day, but probably a lot of people, at least they knew about it, that the priests were making atonement for them. And so wherever they were in the Jewish world, they were getting forgiven because of the action of the priests, not necessarily because of any particular action that they were taking. So the priests were the official Jews and doing most of the work. But at the same time, as this was going on in Second Temple Judaism, it's very clear that people were dissatisfied with, or unfulfilled is probably a better word, by this priestly form of ritual, where everything was done by the priests. And it's very clear, probably from very early on in the Second Temple period, though it's hard to chart, people began to look for other answers. And that's why, for example, you have the Essenes. The Essenes thought that the priests took way too much on themselves, that they weren't maintaining ritual purity in a way that was appropriate. And so the Essenes went off into the desert and did many of the rituals that would be done in the temple, but they did it in the desert by themselves as a community. So they were rejecting the authority of the priests in the temple. And at the same time, you have other groups that don't ostensibly reject the authority of the priests, but begin to supplant it. So you begin to have the development of synagogues, and synagogues, we do have synagogues from the end of the Second Temple period, though most of the synagogues that have been excavated are somewhat later. And we have Christian scriptures talking about a synagogue in Capernaum, in Farnachum, and other places. So we know that, and we do have a synagogue also that was present on Masada, which would be at the very end of the Second Temple period. So we have synagogues developing as a counter institution to the temple. And synagogues seem to be a place where the Torah is read publicly. And also, very early on, prophetic books were read publicly, which later will be called the Haftarah. So synagogues become a place of public teaching, and which was not done at all in this temple. There's no evidence that the Torah was ever read in the temple. And synagogues also become the place where the temple ritual is to some degree copied, but replaced by prayer. So we know that, so each of the major synagogue services is a replacement or at least a stand-in for a temple service. So the morning service, specifically the morning Amidah, is identified as replacing the morning sacrifice. The afternoon service is replacing the afternoon sacrifice, and the evening service is more controversial because there was no evening service, but the various bits of pieces that were not consumed during the day were finished at night, and so the evening service is referred to as corresponding to that. So you begin to have prayer seen as a legitimate form of worship, and even to some degree replacing sacrifice. And,
so I just came to my mind three other women, Dvorah, the judge, Deborah, the judge in the Bible, and the daughters of Rashi. Rashi had only three daughters.
That's much later, Odette. The daughters of Rashi lived in the 11th century, so we can't really jump that far yet.
But Miriam and Dvorah, can we consider them as leaders, prophetess? Well, Miriam wasn't as much into the religion yet, but Dvorah, I think, was more.
Yeah, I think those we could, but there are anecdotal and one-offs, and one-off leaders don't make a pattern. In general, women, and I could do a whole class on women in rabbinic literature in the Bible. Maybe that'll be next year. And then we could find out a lot more about people we've forgotten. But for now, I think women were not playing a large role. And I think that's important. But we've moved on. I think we need, now that we're thinking about the nature of worship. So the nature of worship in Judaism and Christianity, and at the same time as these patterns were developing and probably influenced by these patterns that were happening in the synagogue, the church, as it develops, takes on exactly the same idea of regular services which replace the temple services. So in the synagogue, if we think about the nature of our services and the way the rabbis describe it, the Amidah is the replacement of the sacrifice. And in the Amidah, and therefore, we believe that we are literally in the presence of God for our sacrifice, for the Amidah. That's why we walk back steps and up and forward 3 steps and bow, because traditionally we are in the presence of God even more than at any other time of service. So our service has the following structure. We have the introduction, which is the essentially the creedal statement, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, Hear, O Israel, the eternal our God, the eternal is one, with various prayers of thanksgiving that we set the stage of the day. Then, and we have the call to worship the Baruch Hu. Then we have the middle section, which is the sacrifice, which is the Amidah. And then we have a teaching section, which is the reading of the Torah and the Haftorah. And then because in antiquity, an additional sacrifice was made on Shabbat, we have Musaf, which replaces that additional sacrifice. So that's the nature of a Jewish service. And many of those pieces are very ancient. In fact, all of those go back to Talmudic times and probably, at least in some proto form, existed fairly soon after the destruction of the Second Temple, if not before. Now, if we look at a Christian service, we can see a vast amount of similarity, because Christianity, and this is what's important to realize, Christianity as a religion was developing in the same time as Rabbinic Judaism was developing, and out of the same roots and the same influences. This is the initial, and so even though Christianity has been hugely influenced by the Greeks and moves off in many ways, especially theologically because of the Greeks, ultimately their form of service was very much influenced by the same factors that led to the Jewish service. So what is a Christian service made up of today? It begins with creedal statements like the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. So those are exactly parallel to the Shema. The Shema, because Judaism, we're not a creedal religion, therefore we don't list a whole lot of things, but we say one thing. But in Christianity, they have a whole long creed that they, and so this is, and in a sense, the Shema is there saying, if you can say the Shema, then you are essentially Jewish, really in a sense, and you can stay in. That's saying anybody, I see your hand, Sharon, I'll call on you a second. So the Shema is the way of identifying, yes, I am Jewish. Then we have the entering God's presence, and then we have the teaching. The Christians have creeds saying, and so if you can say the whole Nicene Creed and agree with it, then you can be Catholic or Anglican or Lutheran to some degree. Or the Apostles' Creed, and then in Protestant churches they might say that, but they might also say various ones that are more idiosyncratic. But the first part of the service is always a creedal statement in the more liturgical forms of Christianity. Then in the traditional forms of Christianity, meaning the Greek Orthodox and the Catholic and the Lutheran and the Anglican and others that are fairly traditional, you then have the Eucharist. And the Eucharist is parallel to the Amidah. Because just as in the Amidah we're in God's presence, so the Eucharist is God's physical, literal presence for Christians. So those are exactly identical in purpose. And of course, the Eucharist is, as the Amidah is theoretically a replacement for the sacrifices, the Eucharist is literally a replacement, as Jesus' sacrifice replaces all the other sacrifices. So again, Amidah as sacrifice, Eucharist as sacrifice, these form exactly the same roles. And then Christian services end with a reading from the New Testament, rather from the Hebrew scriptures, from the New Testament, from the prophets, and then the New Testament. So they do 3 readings, to R2. They add an extra one in. So you can see how the Christian service is built on and grows out of the same roots, and probably was influenced by the early Jewish services from which Christianity grew out of. And so they're both parallel to exactly how they develop in exactly the same ways based on the same roots. Sharon? Sharon, you're muted. Sharon, you're muted. You need to unmute yourself.
It struck me that the Roman Catholic Church is built on the same basis as the Roman Empire. That is, it's organized the same way, but the Pope and the cardinals are kind of like the high priest and the Levites, even to the outfit that the high priest wears, is kind of like what the Pope wears now.
Okay, very good. So that leads to, so within liturgically, the services are very similar. And also, but Christianity, so in Judaism, let's start with Judaism. Judaism, what did we do about the priests in reality? Yes, they're still Kohanim, they still have the first Aliyah and can do a Pidyon Haben, but by and large, how have we replaced the priests?
Only symbolically.
No, how?
Only symbolically.
literally-
I mean, with the aliyot, with the aliyot.
No,
with the Aliyah,
not
when
with
we
the
had-
Aliyah. How have we
Rabbi.
literally?
With rabbis.
Louis, what did you say?
With rabbis.
Okay, almost. So the priest is the only one who can daven, who can do the sacrifices. Who can daven Jewishly?
Well, everybody.
The
Exactly.
rabbi?
So no, everybody.
Yeah.
You know, go to an Orthodox or conservative synagogue, and sometimes in a Reform synagogue, and you will see everybody leading. So in Judaism, not the rabbis necessarily, but the people who created the synagogues said that we're going to make a very democratic institution where everybody, at least any man over the age of 13, in antiquity, and today in Orthodoxy that remains, in non-Orthodoxy, any Jew over the age of 13 can daven. So in Judaism, the priests are replaced by everybody, building on the idea that we should be a mamlechet kohanim, a goy kadosh, that we're all part of the kingdom of priests. Therefore, there's no need to separate access to God to a priest. Now, what did we do with the priestly garb and the other implements of the temple? Unless we're Sephardic. Yeah, Paula.
We dress the Torah in them.
Exactly. So the Torah wears the parochet, the fancy garb and the breastplate, and has the crowns. So the Torah replaces the high priest. And to a degree, though, actually, if you think about it, we all do. Because who wears a talit? Everybody. At least,
Everybody.
all men wear a talit in an Orthodox synagogue and brought in non-Orthodox. But so again, the priestly vestments are either given to the Torah or are given to everybody. The priestly duties are given to everybody, so that the only literal sacrifices in a sense that we still make are the challah and the wine, and we all do that. Or so sacrifices are totally moved to everybody, and the priestly garb is moved to the synagogue. And in a sense, the synagogue also takes on all the temple, so that we have an ark similar to the Holy of Holies, and the ark and the Holy of Holies had God's presence in it. So how do we have God's presence in a synagogue?
10 people plus.
Well,
You have to have a minimum of
even
10
more
people.
literally, where
Yeah,
we
but
have the
also-
ark with the eternal light, just as the temple had the Holy of Holies with the eternal light, and in the ark is the Torah. So the Torah is God's presence for Jews. God's word is God's presence, protected by, in the same way in the temple, there was always a ner tamid. So in the synagogue, there's always a ner tamid. And the community comes together to pray and make symbolic sacrifices through prayer, which becomes avodat halev, means prayer of the heart. Now in Christianity, they took these same elements and they began to, and they used them, but in somewhat different ways. So as I think it was Odette or somebody I think who talked about, in the Christian church, while to some degree very democratic in nature, ultimately, and so there was no, so the idea of priests was not present in the early generations, though there already was an idea of apostolic succession, which we'll talk about later. But in the early years, it was more democratic as the synagogue was. But ultimately, the founders of Christianity took the element of priest, and they didn't. And instead of having it vested in the people, they said we are going to take priesthood literally and move it right from the synagogue temple into the church. So therefore, Jewish priests are priests of the order of Aaron, descended from Aaron. Christian priests are called priests of the order of Melchizedek. Does anybody remember who Melchizedek is?
Yeah, kind of.
Well,
I don't know the name.
Melchizedek pops up actually, I think it was last week in the Torah. Was either last week, it was definitely last week in the Torah. When Avram goes to war to rescue his nephew, and then he comes back to Jerusalem, where the king of Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, a king by the name of Melchizedek, which means righteous king, who is a priest, who's described in the Torah as a priest of God, makes sacrifices with Abraham. So Melchizedek is seen as the non-Jewish equivalent of the priesthood, and the Christian priesthood is by ordination, not by descent. So in that sense, they move the same way as the rabbis do, where, and I should mention, ultimately you have rabbinic leadership as well. Now rabbis are separate from the synagogue, especially in the ancient world. Most scholars believe that the rabbinic movement was not necessarily the same movement as this early synagogue movement. But be that as it may, rabbis ultimately are also by ordination, not by descent. And in that sense, rabbis and priests are very similar, though priests are closer, of course, in role to the Aaronic priesthood, whereas rabbis are more, especially in the ancient world, are jurists, not religious leaders as such. So you would never find in an ancient synagogue, or even in an early modern synagogue, that they would have a rabbi who would be davening. Not necessarily. Or even a rabbi that might even be in synagogue every day. Or a rabbi doing pastoral work. That wasn't the rabbinic role. But in the church, the priest took on the role of the Aaronic priest, and therefore, in a church, priests are the only ones, just as the temple priests are the only ones who can, in traditional forms of Christianity, can offer worship. So that in Catholicism, Orthodoxy, in the Lutheran Church, in the Anglican Church, priests are ordained into the order of Melchizedek and take on the role of the priesthood of Aaron for the church. And therefore, they are the only ones who can offer sacrifice. And that's why in Christianity, they're the only ones who can effect transubstantiation, or in the Protestant churches, consubstantiation, where the Eucharist actually becomes for them the body and blood of Jesus. So that is the act of sacrifice that is exactly parallel to what our ancient priests did in the temple. And the priests are the only one who could do it. And likewise, just as priests are the only ones who can effect ordination, priests are the only ones who can confirm young people, and priests are the only ones who can baptize within the more traditional forms of Christianity. And so the priestly role, and in a sense, those are similar to Pidyon Haben, which even in Judaism today, only a priest can do. Elizabeth?
I would like to tell that in Roman Catholic Church, actually everybody can baptize. I don't know like in another churches, but everybody, every person who is Roman Catholic can baptize another person. Only you have to you have to take water, make cross about it, pull it on the head of the child and tell, I baptized you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And even like person can do it.
Okay, so
but preferably it's possible to do it in according to new rules in case of emergency. Okay, if a priest is not available, because baptism by priest, it's not the rule, it's a habit. Because it was recorded, but otherwise everybody can baptize.
in my
I
understanding,
don't know how in other Christian churches.
in my understanding, that was a later change, but I may be wrong. But in general, there are rites in the Catholic and Protestant churches, the more liturgical versions, that only a priest can do. So, and that makes them, and so they're very parallel in that sense to the priest in the temple. And for the same reason, then, the priests also take on the vestments of the high priest.
Mhm.
So that the Pope's, the tiara of the Pope is modeled after the mitre of the high priest, as are the mitres worn by the bishops and the other vestments that are worn. So in that way, again, the Pope and priest replace, and in other forms of the Archbishop or bishops in general, replace the high priest, and the lower priests replace the other priests as well. So you have a very different decision in Christianity and Judaism as to how to take the priestly power and vest it in the new communities, or the newly growing, developing ways of expressing the ancient communities. Now, in a Christianity, one second, Odette, you also have in Catholic churches, and I believe in Orthodox churches as well, you have a part of the church called the tabernacle. And the tabernacle is where the host is kept, meaning the parts after a priest does transubstantiation, or in an Anglican church, consubstantiation, meaning transubstantiation means literally the body and blood of Jesus, whereas consubstantiation, you know what I mean. Consubstantiation means like the blood. So so there's a slightly different idea of how the Protestants look at it, and the Catholics and Greek Orthodox. But either way, after the host has been consecrated, it is then stored in the tabernacle, because it is literally the presence of God. So the tabernacle serves a very similar role as the ark, but instead of having a book in it, it actually still has, it's like the Holy of Holies, that it still has the presence of God. So yeah, Odette?
Yes, it was.
Just a quick question about Judaism. Is it only the rabbi who can officiate, Brit Milah, Pidyon Ben, wedding, any of those rituals? Is it only the rabbi, or any knowledgeable person can do it?
There are no rituals that can only be done. So the Pidyon Haben can only be done by a Kohen. It can't be done by a rabbi.
Right.
At least formally, in its full function. There are no rituals that can only be done by a rabbi. Weddings, the rule for a wedding is that whoever's officiating must be knowledgeable in the laws of marriage, but it doesn't have to be a rabbi. It's not even clear that a conversion needs to be done by a rabbi, but generally it's done in the presence of a Beit Din, and a Beit Din does need to be made up of, which is a legal court, not a religious court, needs to be made up of 3 rabbis. So although there's some texts that suggest that a very knowledgeable person can also be on a Beit Din, and in fact in the Talmud, there are numerous scholars that were not rabbis and had the same authority as those who were. So it's a very different function. You need only a rabbi can ordain another rabbi, because there is an idea, just as in Christianity, you develop an idea of an apostolic succession, meaning that the bishop's authority effectively comes from Peter, who was considered in the Roman Catholic tradition, considered the first bishop and the first pope, at least the major successor of Jesus. Other churches have other ideas of apostolic authority, but ultimately, bishops' authority rests on their being connected with the apostles of Jesus. In Judaism, rabbinic authority ultimately rests on the idea of ordination stemming from Moses. Whether that's true or not is complicated, but that was the idea. But interestingly, according to, in the Middle Ages, there was an idea that the traditional smicha, traditional ordination of rabbis going back to Moses was broken, and therefore all rabbis after the 12th century are only rabbis by courtesy, not by having succession all the way back to Moses. That's a very important, and that affects Jewish mysticism quite significantly, because that becomes a problem for them. But ultimately, in that brief summary, we can see Christianity and Judaism coming from exactly the same roots, but making very different choices. Now, Islam, let's look and think about Islam in this same area. So how does a mosque compare to a synagogue and a church? And interestingly, in this level, Islam and Judaism have much more in common than Islam and Christianity. Though I don't know that, I think it's coincidental similarity in a large part rather than causal similarity. So what is a mosque, and how are a mosque and a synagogue similar? Yeah, Paula.
Men and women pray in separate sections.
That was actually true in churches too, by the way, and in the Middle Ages. So that was something that was very common in many different religions in antiquity. But you're right, though, that even today it still pertains in Islam, and much more strongly in Islam. So in Judaism, there have been reformist movements that have that have brought men and women together. In Islam, that hasn't happened, at least to a great extent yet. Yeah, Louis?
Excellent.
They both have the custom of washing hands before praying.
Very good. Yeah. So in Judaism and in Islam, there is a strong tradition of washing. So ritual purity, which vanishes mostly from Christianity. So that washing before services, which in some sense, in Islam, they wash both the hands and the feet, connecting very closely with the idea of the priests and what we do before duchening, when the Kohanim bless the people, both their hands and feet are washed. So washing becomes very important. And in Islam, and also in Judaism, it's traditional to wash first thing before you then do your praying. In Islam, you wash before every service, and it's very organized. So every mosque will have a place to wash before people come in. And of course, in Judaism, we wash ritually when we do the motzi, because the motzi is an act of sacrifice, and therefore we are taking the place of the priest. That's also, by the way, why we salt the challah, because that was what was done in the ancient temple. So washing to prepare for being in God's presence is found both in Judaism and Islam. But then there are other similarities as well. So a mosque and a synagogue always pray face the east. Now, or the West. So that in Japan and in Asia, synagogues generally face west, they don't face east. In Islam, that's true as well, and originally in Islam, the mosque was supposed to face Jerusalem, but later on, they decided to refocus it and so they face Mecca now rather than Jerusalem. Because even though it's sometimes, Jews get all uppity about whether or not Islam has any real connection with Jerusalem. In early times, they definitely did look at Jerusalem as the holy city. That's why in the Hadith, you have Muhammad visiting the Temple Mount. And so even though Islam was founded around Mecca and Medina have by far replaced Jerusalem as the holiest cities of Islam, in the earliest strata of Islam, Jerusalem was indeed very holy and was seen as the holy city. So it's sometimes it's a little bit disingenuous of us to decide our idea of Jerusalem as holy is right and everybody else's is wrong.
It's very objective.
Yeah.
So we have to realize that there could be many groups that look at Jerusalem as a holy city, and it can be authentic in all of them, even though we all look at it in different ways. Be that as it may, so originally the mosque faced Jerusalem, later Mecca and Medina, and the Muslims to some degree are much more careful than we are. So they will often use a compass so that they face as directly as possible towards Mecca and Medina, where in Judaism it's much more notional. As long as our synagogue in Edmonton or Syracuse faces east, that's sufficient. It doesn't have to be southeast or whatever. So I once had a prayer rug that was given to me by Muslim friends, and it had a compass on it so that I could make sure that I was really facing Mecca when I was praying. So they're more careful about that. But so then we have leadership. Even in Sunni Islam, and we're going to talk more about leadership later on, but in Sunni Islam, anybody can lead prayers. Though they often may have an imam, it doesn't require an imam to lead prayers. So anybody can lead prayers. So in that sense, they chose the same path that Jews chose, not to have a priesthood, but to have, but to be the ummah, the whole people were considered in that sense to be holy. So that's a very, very important similarity between the synagogue and the mosque. And then each mosque will have a niche on the eastern wall or whatever wall is facing closest to Mecca. And in that niche is always kept the copy of the Quran. Now, in Judaism, the copies of the Torah are always, of course, that are kept in the Ark are not books, which in ancient times would be called a codex, but instead we always have them on scrolls, written on parchment, and written by hand. So that would be the Torah, which we keep in the Ark. In Islam, there's always a copy of the Quran, but it can be printed. It doesn't have to be written by hand. Although there was a debate about that when printing presses came in, whether or not a printed version of the Quran could be utilized. And effectively, the only decision was that the Quran has to be in Arabic, but it doesn't have to be a scroll, or a codex that is handwritten. But even though,
but also,
yeah. Yes, so Dad?
But the Quran, as you read it, well, as I want to call him the Khazan, because you always have somebody who chants the Quran, the leader. It doesn't have the issue of vowels as we have in our Torah scroll. Our Torah scroll, we read it without vowels, right? There has no vowels in it. This differs. But also, I'm ignorant. The Muslims pray sitting on the floor. not even on the benches when actually prayers are happening. Well, is that a reason? Is there any religious reason for it?
Well, that's
Not
their
good for him.
tradition. That their tradition is to pray while seated on the floor and then bow. And there was much more bowing, by the way, in ancient Jewish services. But the rabbis decided to curtail it. Louis, is your hand up still, or is it just you haven't lowered it yet? Okay. So there are significant differences, which I'll talk about, but in surface there's many surface similarities. So the niche forms the same role as the ark does in Judaism, and the Quran serves exactly the same purpose as the Torah. It represents, and oftentimes there often will even be a light in front of the niche as representing God's presence. So the niche. So in this sense, Islam and Judaism both enshrine God's presence through a book, while in Christianity, it's done through what they believe is the literal presence as represented by the Eucharist or the consecrated hosts that are kept in the tabernacle. And there's a light kept lit in front of the tabernacle because of that purpose, that it similar to based on the Ner Tamid from the temple, for exactly that reason, representing the light of God's presence. So now, ritually, the Muslim prayer service is much simpler than Jewish. There is no element in the service itself that replaces sacrifice, as is found in Judaism and Christianity. And maybe not surprisingly, because Islam develops in so much as it's influenced by Judaism and Christianity, coming as it does in the 7th century, sacrifices have been absent, or literal sacrifices have been absent from Judaism and Christianity for 600 years. So therefore, in Islam, the main body of the service is the creedal section that we talked about earlier, where the Shahada is recited by the Imam or whoever's leading prayers and everybody else, and they say the Shahada, and which is a statement of faith. I believe in God, Allah is God, and Muhammad is his prophet, and then it goes on. So it's a creed similar to the Shema or the creedal statements recited in Christian prayers. And then similar to Judaism and Christianity, the next part of the service will be a recitation from the Quran, and that prayer and that is done in Arabic. Always throughout the Islamic world, the Quran has to be read in Arabic, just as Judaism up until recently, and probably in most synagogues still, the Torah is read at least first in Hebrew, and in Christian services, initially in Latin or Greek or whatever primary language of that church. So there were Coptic churches, Armenian churches, Russian church, Orthodox churches, where those languages were the language that was seen as holy, and the services were always done in those languages. In Judaism and Christianity, at least in modern times, in non-Orthodox circles, in Reform in the most, but in also to some degree in conservative, you have the intrusion of the secular languages as the primary language of prayer. Not the intrusion, but the usage of English or whatever language as the primary language of prayer. That's happened in Christianity much earlier as well, although Latin prevailed in the Catholic Church until the 60s and Vatican II. But in the Protestant churches, that was one of the major reformations, was that the service would be done in the vernacular. And Islam has not made that change in any major way, though the sermon is always given in the vernacular. That was true everywhere. After all, religious leaders want to be understood. So if I gave my sermon in Hebrew, here in Syracuse, I'd feel a sense of satisfaction, but probably not many people would understand what I was talking about. And likewise, if an imam in India gave his sermon in Arabic, it wouldn't be of much use, or a priest gave his sermon in Latin. So the sermons very early on were moved to the vernacular. Now, interestingly, in the big Reformed synagogues in New York, Temple Emmanuel and the other very early Reformed synagogues, for many years into the late part of the 19th century, they were founded in the late 19th century from influx of German Jews. They kept doing the sermon in German for many years, because and only turned to English later. So that was sort of an ironic, and a bit of an irony about, not about any problem with German, at least at that period, and but just the fact of the value in Reform Judaism, which was very early in Judaism for the vernacular, transitioned in some way slowly as immigrants came to the United States. They also, by the way, didn't want, and one of the reasons they wanted to keep the Eastern European Jews out, because they didn't want intrusions of Yiddish into their German synagogues.
Also, their congregations served a mostly German population.
Absolutely.
And they, I mean, that's not that much different than the history of Jewish immigration, whether it's in Canada or the United States. The Germans considered themselves
Superior.
enlightened, shall we say, and Reform stemmed out of that modern movement for enlightenment. And it's interesting because in Reform circles, there's been a huge resurgence of Hebrew and the learning of Hebrew and the prayers in Hebrew, and the use of transliteration in prayer books allows people who are not native Hebrew speakers to at least be able to read the words, understand the words, and be part of that. And I mean, I've done a lot of work with lay leadership and taken many courses through Reform on lay leadership. And the only thing I'm not allowed to do as a lay leader is a wedding.
Yeah, and although I don't want to get too much into this, but to
No,
some
just as an
degree,
FYI.
well, no, Paul is absolutely right. And although you will find more English in Reform services today than you'll find in conservative or Orthodox, but if you went to a Reform service when I was growing up, I think, I remember the rabbi, they did the Shema in Hebrew and the first line of Vishamru, and a few other things, but not much. So Reform has transitioned quite a huge amount in the 20th century I am not criticizing the philosophic embrace of praying in a language that you understand. That makes, it's not something I embrace in my own life, but it totally makes sense. Because if you're praying to God, you should be praying in a way that you understand. Otherwise, how can you speak authentically? So that was why the early Reformers made that huge change. And so, but what's interesting, and I will mention this, although it goes a little bit beyond where I was going, it's interesting in not only in all rabbi, the whole role of the rabbi has gotten far closer to the priestly model in the 20th century than it ever was since rabbis were invented 2,000 years ago until about 1850, 1860-ish. So that in some way, so that when I was growing, when I was much younger, even in conservative synagogues, rabbis were, when you had a service that was led by the rabbi or by the cantor. So the idea of lay participation had been cut out. And also the rabbis in all movements picked up all of the pastoral work that had been much more considered priestly. And what's interesting is in many Reform synagogues, I remember the Reform synagogue I grew up in, that the rabbi always was gone for usually, I guess, July. And there were lay services, and everybody felt that the lay services weren't real because they weren't led by the rabbi. And so my brother, when he did a research in England, we can see the priestization of the rabbinate in an interesting way. So English rabbis, whether they were Orthodox or Reform or conservative, there were no conservative yet, but Orthodox or Reform in the early 20th century, all of them would wear robes. It didn't make a difference. And in fact, they'd also wear priestly bands, which were sort of a tie. So you see this in Orthodox synagogues and in Reform synagogues. And it was very common in both Orthodox synagogues and in Reform that at the end of the service, the rabbi would do a benediction. And this was always done, especially in Reform synagogues. The rabbi would lift up his hands and he would do the priestly benediction. So my brother did research in Orthodox, these are mostly what we call United Synagogue Orthodox, which is the mainstream Orthodox, and in Reform in England. So we did a survey of congregations that when a layperson was leading the service and the rabbi was not present, if the layperson wore a robe, or if the layperson lifted their hands to do the priestly benediction. And what he found was that in no synagogues in England did the layperson ever wear the robe. And there were some synagogues where the layperson would do a priestly benediction, but they never raised their hands. And they also often would use other blessings rather than the priestly blessing. So we can see that to some degree, especially in England, in the 19th and early 20th century, the rabbi was very much placed into the role of a priest. I think that's changed significantly. And in all movements of Judaism, we've returned to the more traditional rabbinic model of relative equality of what people can do. And as Paula mentioned, in the Reform movement, there's no limitations on rabbis doing anything but marriages. And effectively, that's true in Orthodox and conservative, but not because of Jewish law, but because of generally civil law, which requires a clergy person to do the wedding. So it may be well that in the Reform movement it's limited to that as well for that same reason of civil law rather than of religious law. Okay, I want to move back to Islam though. So Odette, yeah.
Well, then I will keep my comment for later.
Okay, so we have some of the ritually wise in the synagogue, we can see similarities in how the mosque developed and how the synagogue developed. But we all can see the similarity in the churches, though the churches chose very different ideas about priesthood and very different ideas about the presence of God, which are based on the nature of Christianity and Christian theology as opposed to Jewish theology or Muslim theology. Because one of the things that, in some sense, Judaism and Islam are far closer than Judaism and Christianity, or Islam and Christianity. So that the idea of the absolute monotheistic idea of absolutely one God, which cannot be divided in any way, shape, or form, is very strong in both Judaism and Islam, whereas Trinitarian Christianity accepts the idea of divisions in God and in the physical and the possibility of the physical presence of God, which is not possible really in Judaism or Islam. Yes, there is an idea of the Shekhinah, but even as much as you have the Shekhinah can be felt in a spiritual way, but can't be touched with any sense of physicality. So in that sense, Judaism and Islam are much stronger in those views. Now, Christianity and Islam are similar in the embrace of the idea of saints. In Islam, most of the saints, or they don't use the term, but the figures that form similar to saints are the companions of Muhammad. So you have the first generation of Islam, where Muhammad is vouchsafed the revelation of the Quran, and then you have his companions who live out Islam in that generation, and and they become considered as holy. And then you have other saints over time, especially in different movements of Islam. But you have an idea of saints. Now, interestingly, in Ashkenazic Judaism, this is not at all present. But in Sephardic Judaism, or actually North African Judaism, especially in North Africa, in Morocco, you do have a very strong cult of saints. So Judaism, of course, is a very local religion in many ways, as are Islam and Christianity. Talking about Judaism is dangerous. It's much easier to talk about Judaisms, and then we can see local differences. So now, holiday-wise, how do we look at Judaism and Islam? So if we look at—
But the Muslims, from my understanding, they prayed 5 times.
Okay,
as opposed to the Jews who pray 3 times.
Okay, so that's a good point. So in Judaism, so it's well known that Jews pray 3 times a day and Muslims pray 5 times a day. How many liturgical hours, by the way, are there? Do we have anybody who remembers?
What is the question?
How many liturgical hours are there in the Catholic Church and in Greek Orthodox, for that matter? I think there's 7. 7 times where they pray. So multiple praying is something we have in common, although it's worked out now that it's less prevalent, and most people will pray on whatever they're, most Muslims will go to the mosque, at least go on Friday. Not most, but those religious Muslims will go on Friday. Very religious Muslims will go every day and pray, or pray at home 5 times a day. Jews will go to synagogue, those who do pray on Shabbat, whether Friday or Saturday. And religious Jews will pray 3 times a day. Most Christians, unless you're a priest, a priest, by the way, is required to say Mass every day. But many Christians, it used to be more common that, and often churches will have Masses every day, in the Orthodox and in the Catholic world, but it's less common for people to go than in the past. But it used to be very common for people to go to different Masses during the day. There's a general requirement only for 1 prayer. You don't have to do it 3 or 4 times. But regular prayer is a similarity between the different traditions. How many times you pray is not necessarily identical, though it's more complicated than we think of if we think of how our religions develop. Now, I want to ask you, how many times actually are Jews required to pray in a day? So, Louis, how many times? Well, I'm not going to single anybody out.
It depends which year. It depends which year. If it's thousands of years ago.
No, I'm talking about today.
Well, I think the Orthodox in Israel will do 3 times.
Not only in Israel.
I would say 5 times.
Okay, we're going to get to Sam in a second, but
Originally,
in Syracuse, we pray organized 3 times a day. Every day we have a Shachrit service, we have a Mincha service, and we have a Mariv service.
We can sleep a bit more then.
Now, Sam said 5 times. So how do we get the other 2?
Well, you're supposed to pray in the morning when you wake up, and also at night, you're supposed to say the Shema at least.
Exactly. So the moment you get up, you're supposed to actually go to the bathroom and then wash, and then you're supposed to pray. And then you go to synagogue, and then you're supposed to say the Shema before you go to bed. So in Judaism, it's actually 5 times too. Although the major service is what we do in Amidah. So in a sense, in Judaism, we would say that's a necessary piece of what actually counts as a service. That we only do 3 times a day. But we say because we say the Shema only 4 times a day, morning when we get up, and then in the morning service, and then in the evening service, and when we go to bed. We don't say that even 5 times a day. I can add,
but for the
wait a second.
okay, I just want to add that for the Jews, when they do the 3 services, not the 5, the 3, you need a congregation of 10 people. For the
That's not correct.
Muslims, I don't
That's
think,
not correct.
but
Wait, Odette, you don't need a 10. If you don't have a minyan, you can still do the service. If you're alone, you still do the service. So a 10 will allow you to
Right.
do the whole service.
okay,
But so it's in Islam too. You can be in a mosque or you can be at home. It doesn't matter. You pray whether you're at home or not. In general, in Christianity, though not always, doing a Eucharist service does require to be on consecrated ground. Although I believe that they can do it in emergency situations, not. So in Judaism, so all the religions have multiple forms of prayer. Islam has 5 organized times of prayer, whereas Judaism has 3, and Christianity has, depending on different numbers, depending on how you categorize it. So there is an interesting story in the Quran. Muhammad, and because by the way, the requirement of 5 prayers a day is hadith, is tradition, it's not in the Quran. So according to the hadith, Muhammad wants to know, God says that you're supposed to pray. So Muhammad then wonders how many times he's supposed to pray. So he asks Moses, and Moses says, well, go ask God. And Allah tells Muhammad, you need to pray 1,000 times every day. And Muhammad goes back to Moses, and Moses says, what are you, crazy? You're not going to have time to do anything else. Go back. And so then Muhammad goes back to God, and God says 5 times, that's enough. Now, but in Islam, the idea of praying is that you're constantly in God's presence, and you're constantly giving thanks and swearing obedience to God, which is the essence of what the Shahada is submitting yourself to God's authority. Okay, so that takes us through prayer. So now I want to go, and thank you, Odette, for reminding me, because prayer obviously is what goes on in a synagogue. Similar to Islam, Judaism, Christianity in its more ancient forms, meaning Greek Orthodox, all the Orthodox churches still, the Catholic Church, and the more liturgical forms of Protestantism, Lutherans, Anglicans, and the like, are all liturgical religions, meaning that there's a liturgy that's set. And that's true also in Judaism and in Islam, that there is a set liturgy. It's not a free-for-all where the priest or where the minister is inventing prayers, but instead is very set. So in that sense, Judaism, traditional Christianity, and Islam are all liturgical religions. So that's a similarity. Now, what about holidays? So what are the major holidays of Judaism?
high holiday.
Okay, so we have Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, yeah, Paula?
Sukkot, Pesach.
So
and
for
Shavuot
the 4 pilgrimage holidays.
were
The 3 pilgrimage holidays.
Were the pilgrimage holidays.
Sukkot, Pesach, and Shavuot.
Yeah.
Right.
And then we have the high holy days. We have, what else? Anybody?
Well, Hanukkah and Purim are rabbinic holidays, not Torah mandated holidays.
Technically, yeah, they're rabbinic. Yeah, absolutely. So, and we'll get to those. So we have now. So we have the Torah mandated holidays are Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Shavuot, and Pesach.
Yeah.
Those are the major holidays of the Torah. And what is the nature of our pilgrimage festivals? What do they all have in common?
Thanksgiving.
Essentially, yes. But Thanksgiving for what, Paula?
Well, 2 of them are, well, one is a harvest festival, one is a freedom festival, and one is the giving of the Torah festival.
Actually, they're all harvest festivals.
Yeah, but what I was going to say is that you're bringing the first of whatever is new in your they're agriculturally based holidays.
Absolutely. So our three major holidays, and in the Torah, it's very clear that Sukkot, Pesach, and Shavuot are the most important holidays of the year, far more important than Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, which don't have full billing in all of the texts of the Torah. But these three pilgrimage festivals were the times that there were pilgrimages. They were the time when everybody was supposed to go to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices in the temple. And initially, they were all sacrificial holidays of Thanksgiving for the harvest. In Shavuot and Sukkot, we were thankful for the end of the summer harvest. And then in Pesach, the harvest of lambs and the harvest of new wheat. And in Shavuot, the barley harvest. So we have the major harvests of the year. And then each one of them also has, to a degree, an idea of connecting with historical Jewish events. Though it's very clear that the harvest is much more important, except for Pesach, really than for the others, because for Pesach is always associated with the exodus from Egypt, but Shavuot and Sukkot are not always associated with their historical significance. So laterly, and in some books of the Torah, Shavuot is associated with the giving of the Torah, and Sukkot is associated with the time spent in the desert. Those were the three most important holidays of antiquity. And then you have Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where Rosh Hashanah is very marginal in the Torah. It's called Yom Teruah, and is not. It doesn't have very much significance. Yom HaKippurim, though, is very significant, being the Day of Atonement. And laterally, of course, Rosh Hashanah will grow in importance and have the importance of a day of judgment that it has today. But that was a fairly late development. So those are the major holidays. And then, as Lewis rightly pointed out, Purim and Hanukkah are very late and are more historically based holidays and even very limited presence of God. So much so that the book of Esther doesn't mention God once, and the Hanukkah books weren't even included in the Torah. In the Bible. So those are, and then we have a bunch of other fast days. Tisha B'Av, commemorating destruction of various destructions, as do the other small fast days that we have during the year. Along with the fast of the firstborn, which is a late fast connected with, a biblical fast connected with Pesach, and so that one. But we have a number of little fast days as well. Now, Christianity had the same book that we have. They weren't terribly interested in Hanukkah or Purim, but they were interested very much in the other holidays of the year. So how did Christianity use the same source material to take on the holidays that we also celebrate? Well, yeah, Sharon.
I just wanted to comment that they tie in Jesus dying at Passover, because that connects him to the sacrificial lamb. But it was said that when he came to Jerusalem, people were waving palm fronds, and that makes it Sukkot.
Okay, so there are two theories. Either it was really Sukkot when it happened, or time was compacted in Christian scriptures, and therefore he came to Jerusalem on Sukkot and then was crucified around Passover. But of course, as Sharon noted, Christianity uses Passover for rebirth, and in Passover we have rebirth in our Passover too. That's what the egg symbolizes, and the green that we eat also to some degree symbolizes rebirth. So Christianity was using the same idea. So Jesus connects with rebirth, resurrection. Also, the Paschal Lamb, Jesus is seen as the Passover sacrifice, bringing redemption. So even if even if the crucifixion did not take place around Passover, symbolically, Passover is replaced by Easter. And in fact, Easter used to be celebrated always on Passover, but at the Council of Nicaea, the timing of Easter was changed so that the connection between Passover and Easter would be broken, or at least weakened. But it is called Pescha in various, in Latin and other languages, so very much reminding us that Passover and Easter come from the same holiday.
Are you going to do something on the Council of Nicaea at some point in this lecture series?
No,
Because
not
you're referred to it a lot, and it seemed to me that's when the Emperor Constantine decided that Christianity should be the official religion of the Roman Empire, and they had a lot of other rules that they made that practically made Judaism illegal.
Well, I have talked about that. It is important for understanding the whole process of the ancient world and the relations between Judaism and Christianity. So maybe I'll talk about it in more detail. But it was very important in transforming and moving and essentially outlawing the older Jewish Christian model, where Christianity was very much a form of Judaism, and celebrating Greek Christianity, or Greek philosophically influenced Christianity and Gentile Christianity. But I want to leave that. So we have Easter and Passover are really the same holiday, or at least building on the same roots. So what other holidays in the Christian year can we say this about?
Well, isn't Pentecost really the same as Shavuot?
Absolutely. So Pentecost, in fact, we use the same name for it. Pentecost is exactly parallel to Shavuot. So in Shavuot, we celebrate the giving of the Torah. And what happens at Pentecost? The Spirit of God, of Jesus, rests upon the apostles. So there you have the presence of God in both, in coming down to earth, or celebrated in the Torah, or in the presence of Jesus. So yeah, so Pentecost and Shavuot are again cousins. Are there any other holidays in the Christian year where we could draw these same conclusions?
Well, my understanding is that Tabernacles is like Sukkot.
Christians don't celebrate Tabernacles particularly. So Tabernacles is the name given to Sukkot in Christian scriptures, but there isn't a Christian holiday particularly called Tabernacle.
Okay.
Tabernacles.
Thanksgiving has become a secular holiday rather than a religious holiday, but it seems to correspond to Sukkot.
Yeah, Thanksgiving so that's a very late holiday. It's, in so much as it's formalized. Harvest festivals were very, very common in medieval Europe and in the Americas. And there were many different dates that people celebrated Thanksgiving for the harvest. And it was a religious festival in that people looked to and celebrated God, the harvest coming from God. Now, if we look at the texts from the Pilgrims as to why they created Thanksgiving, it's very much based on Sukkot, that they realized that Sukkot was a celebration of the harvest, and they modeled their original Thanksgiving on Sukkot. So in so much as, this is much later, but so it's not at the origins of Christianity, but it certainly was there for the Pilgrims. And of course, Abraham Lincoln made it a national holiday in the middle of the Civil War as a way of trying to build morale in the North. And that's the origins of Thanksgiving as a civil, secular holiday for all Americans. And of course, Thanksgiving is, in the United States, it's very, very common for everybody to celebrate Thanksgiving. So you'll find Jews, everybody. There's hardly a Jewish family, except maybe among the Haredim. But Orthodox, conservative, Reform, everybody celebrated Thanksgiving. Whereas in Canada, of course, where Thanksgiving retains its religious significance far longer, it's very rare, or it's much rarer for Canadian Jews to celebrate Thanksgiving. I'm sure it happens a lot, but it's not nearly as common. You know, when I was a kid, we would go to Brooklyn for Pesach. We'd go to Brooklyn for other Hanukkah, and we'd go to my grandparents. We went essentially every Sunday, but special trips for those, and for Thanksgiving, where all my cousins would come down. And our Thanksgiving dinner was, we'd start with chopped liver, then we'd have chicken soup with kreplach, then we'd have kishka, and then we'd have turkey and stuffing and other things like that. And then 3 hours or 6 hours later, we'd have pumpkin pie because it was milchik. That was our Thanksgiving. And I went to a Chinese friend's house when I was in university for Thanksgiving, and they started with hot and sour soup. Then they had a whole series of dim sum. Then they had turkey, stuffing, and the like. And then they waited 6 hours. Then they had right away the pumpkin pie and pecan pie. So that in America, in the United States, excuse me, it's become very much an American holiday, which everybody celebrates. Okay, but Enka?
Yeah, I'd just like to bring a happy message. A long time ago, Boniface, who was a missionary, came to my part of the world, now called the Netherlands, but at that time we didn't even have a name. And he got very worried because the local people were celebrating something very strange with lights all over. And he wrote to the Pope and said, look, what do I do? Because they don't really look like Christians, because they have this pagan tradition of having, well, he did not use the word pagan, but they have this old tradition of the lights and whatever. And at that time, the Pope was, for maybe a change, very enlightened and said, don't worry about details. You know, as long as they believe something, be happy with them. I think this is such a wonderful message. And I want you to be happy with me, an ex-Calvinist, about the happy Santa Claus celebration in the Netherlands. Now, you can call it whatever you want, Calvinistic or not, but it's a crazy festival at the beginning of December. And we give gifts to each other, and we do it with crazy rhymes. We poke fun at our ministers, at our parents, at our teachers, at our politicians. It's a wild festival. And my message is, it is so nice to be in this class and hear all these discussions, as long as we can enjoy learning from each other and not being dogmatic about it. And you're doing a great job.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And so Christmas is a good next one to think about. Obviously, Santa Claus and different customs about St. Nicholas were much compacted into Christmas in the United States. But does Christmas have any cognate with biblical origins? And really not. Christmas comes more from Roman holidays because, of course, Christianity was not only in conversation with Jewish sources, but was also in conversation with the Roman world and had a whole series of holidays and the like as well. But what's important to note, and that's important to remember, so Christianity, though, it doesn't have a whole host of holidays. Obviously, there were saint days and other celebrations throughout the year, but in major festivals, Christianity was much more limited in the number of festivals. Judaism is pretty profligate in the number of festivals that we have. Having said that, so Christianity, but what I want to mention though, and is important, is that even with the Council of Nicaea and the attempt to disconnect Passover and Easter, there still was an importance to keeping Easter in the spring. Just as, Christmas has to stay in the winter. So for different reasons, Christians and Jews value the calendar and the calendrical seasons. So that in Judaism, we value it because having a spring harvest festival in the winter just doesn't make any sense. And in Christianity, maybe connected with that, but also the ideas of the symbols of Easter being spring symbols require that it happen in the spring. And thus, so Christian and Jewish holidays are very calendar based. Now, I want to touch, now Hanukkah is an interesting inversion. As Lewis mentioned, Hanukkah is very unimportant, and the observances of Hanukkah are minimal. If you think about it, you light a menorah, and there's some special prayers that are said in the morning service, but not significant. And you can work on Hanukkah, you can do whatever you want. So Hanukkah is this strange sort of holiday that's very minor. And in antiquity and throughout the Middle Ages, it was popular, and people had foods that like latkes, which were oily but are fun to eat, or jelly donuts, sufganiyot, and the like. But Hanukkah was considered very unimportant. If you ask today and did a survey of not knowledgeable Jews, but general Jews, or you ask Christians, what is an important holiday? How many people do you think would say Hanukkah? Nearly everybody. And so this is an example where Christianity influences Judaism rather than Judaism influencing Christianity, in that because Christians have such an important holiday during December, ultimately Hanukkah grew in importance, or at least perceived importance, because teachers wanted to be able to teach the Jewish Christmas in school, or Jewish kids wanted to have a holiday that was as big and as nice as Christmas. And of course, there was the not totally coincidental symbol of light that was important for both holidays. That in the Northern Hemisphere, where it gets dark, having candles out is a really nice thing as the days get short. So light was a very common symbol. And also, when you're in Edmonton and you're sitting under 17 feet of snow, then having an idea that spring is going to come, celebrated by the light of rebirth, that's a really nice idea. Mm-hmm. So Hanukkah has grown in importance. And of course, gift giving comes directly from Christianity into Judaism from Hanukkah. And it's not a terrible thing. There is nothing wrong with giving gifts on Hanukkah. I might even sound even more heretical when I say there's absolutely nothing wrong with kids dressing up on Halloween, and just having fun. It doesn't have any religious significance, but it's just fun. But for Hanukkah, we do have our own.
But the danger of, sorry to. Yeah, I just find the danger of it. There's nothing wrong in doing Halloween, obviously, and any other of these, or giving gifts. The only danger is that for the Jews is that if they are not maintaining the knowledge of their holidays and the celebrations of their holidays, then over the years, over hundreds of years, Hanukkah will become just like any other, you're just giving gifts. That's all there is to it.
Well, but if you think about the fact
there's a fine line.
If you think about the fact that for most of Hanukkah's history, it wasn't terribly much more important than just, we remember that there were these priests that we sort of know about who rededicated the temple, but we don't know any of the details. And we really don't care. We're just going to light candles and eat sufganiyot. The modern focus of Hanukkah on the military victory of the Hasmoneans and all of the history around that was largely forgotten because nobody was reading the book of Maccabees, which talked about it. So Hanukkah didn't have, Hanukkah's significance today as trying to remain proud of being Jewish in a secular world or in a hostile world is very modern. So, and mostly comes from Israel and the rise of Zionism. So it's hard to make that claim. Yeah, Louis?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention about Halloween that it shouldn't replace or overshadow or upstage Purim.
Yeah, but I agree with that. But Purim is totally different time of year, and I think allowing kids to have fun twice a year is not a terrible thing. I don't think it upstages Purim. I think gift giving on Hanukkah does more upstaging at Purim than anything about Halloween, because traditionally Purim was the gift giving day, not Hanukkah.
Good point.
That's more of a problem than
Yeah.
the other. Now I want to
Yeah.
jump to Islam in our last 10 minutes. So we can see a little bit of a lot of influence from the Bible shaping Christianity, but obviously and shaping Christianity, but other influences coming in and shaping Christianity as well. In Judaism, likewise, we see the influence of the Bible on our, especially the Torah, on our major holidays, but our holidays have developed as well. So Rosh Hashanah, has developed as a new year in a very strong way. And some scholars suggest that's because it was also a new year time in Persia, where many Jews were living. So maybe an outside influence, maybe not, but Rosh Hashanah was present in the Bible, but it grows in importance in the rabbinic period and onward. And then, of course, Purim and Hanukkah, which were not biblical in the least, or at least, and certainly not in the Torah, become major holidays for a variety of reasons. And I think Hanukkah and Purim became major holidays also because people needed diaspora holidays that spoke to what it was like living in the diaspora. And even though Hanukkah takes place in Israel, its history reflects the dangers of diaspora life very well, as does Purim. So also, for Jews who lived and were being persecuted, having two fun holidays was certainly a motivation for having holidays as well, and stressing those holidays, which were just about fun without a very much serious message. Now, what about Islam? So what holidays are there in Islam?
Eid.
Yeah, well, there are two Eids, the Eid al-Fitr.
Eid al-Adha. There is Eid al-Adha.
Yeah, so the
and Eid al-Fitr.
Yeah.
And Eid al-Fitr.
Yeah, so those are the two holidays of Islam, one of which comes at the end of Ramadan, and the other celebrates, it comes at a different time, I think towards the other part of the year. But those are the two major Muslim celebrations. And then we have Ramadan. And what is Ramadan?
Fasting.
It's the fast for 30 days.
Yeah, so it's a what we would call in Judaism a half fast, meaning it's during the daylight hours you fast, and then you can eat what you want at night. But it's a 30-day long fast of essentially a penitential period. Now, Islam has one really other celebration that's important to mention in connection with this, which is Hajj. And what is Hajj?
Going to the Kaaba for religious
Pilgrimage.
Pilgrimage to
visiting the Kaaba.
to Mecca starts
Pilgrimage, yeah.
where you go to Medina and Mecca to celebrate the early events of Islam, as well as the sacrifice of Ishmael at the Kaaba, which is a later symbol added to the Hajj. So how do these then connect with or reflect or similar or different to Judaism and Christianity?
Well, you only have to do the Hajj once in your lifetime.
Okay, so the Hajj as a pilgrimage it's in a sense, it's not unlike other pilgrimages that are found throughout the globe. So that Jews will, even today we make, we make pilgrimages to Israel, and in antiquity, 3 times a year, Jews would go up to Jerusalem. Now, of course, in the early period when those laws were inaugurated, it wasn't so hard because most Jews were living in Israel. So therefore, and probably the law of going up to Jerusalem was only observed in the southern kingdom of Judah, because the northern kingdom had its own 2 temples. But the pilgrimages to a temple were very important in ancient Judaism, and became even more important in Second Temple Judaism, when Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem was effectively, though not only, the temple, the major temple that existed, because there actually were other temples that were there. So like Islam, we have the idea of pilgrimage, though in Islam, you only need to do Hajj once. In Christianity, pilgrimages are common, though not required. So, so people make a pilgrimage to Rome, especially during years designated as holy years. They'll make pilgrimages to various shrines like Lourdes, but these are not required. And in the Protestant world, pilgrimages are even less important. So pilgrimages are still there in Christianity, but especially in Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, still important, but in the Protestant, not as important or not central. So, but the pilgrimages are still there. Yeah, look, Sam?
So I'm wondering if the Ramadan, I don't know this, but I'm wondering if the Ramadan is similar to our month of Elul. So it's a time of contemplation and building up to the judgment that we're going to be having during the high holiday.
But Ramadan doesn't build up to anything in the same way. So the month itself is the month of contemplation. The Eid at the end is a celebratory period. So there's no idea like Yom Kippur of atonement or repentance on the Eid. The month itself serves the purpose. So Ramadan is its month of preparation as well as its atonement period. Now, so therefore, in that sense, and there are other small holidays that are celebrated in different parts of the Islamic world. So there's one holiday called Noled al-Nabi, which is the birthday of the prophet, which is celebrated just in some parts of the Islamic world, but not universally. So the only ones that are universal are the two Eids and Ramadan. Now, are these in any way similar to our harvest festivals? And the answer is, in Islam, no, they're not. Because, so there are no harvest festivals in Islam, and maybe that's not a coincidence, considering that harvesting is not a great feature of Arabia. It's a very arid climate, so people live, based on in oases, but there isn't a major aspect of harvest. So there is no necessity for these holidays to fall any particular time in the year, and that's effectively what is not built into the Muslim system. So so the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar with a solar correction. That's why when we come to March this year, you're going to notice that there's a second month of Adar, because our holidays came at the very beginning of September this year, and that's as early as they can come. So we have to push them back so they come in October next year, and then they work their way slowly back towards the beginning of September. So our calendar is a corrected lunar calendar, which more or less keeps our holidays and in the right times of year. Because our holidays are harvest festivals, and you can't have a spring harvest festival in October. And for that reason, the early Christian festivals were kept in place as well. And then the Christian calendar ultimately was based on a solar calendar. It still, by the way, had problems because it took a while before they worked out exactly how the leap year should work. But more or less, things were kept in season. The Muslim calendar, like the Jewish calendar, is a lunar calendar, but the Muslim calendar is an uncorrected lunar calendar. Or at least, uncorrected sounds judgmental, and it shouldn't be. They chose not to correct their calendar. Oh, I need a new, hello, Rabbi Kuno speaking. Yeah, right. I've been offered $10,000 loan has been accepted, even though I didn't apply for one. So the Muslim calendar is uncorrected, and in Islam, its holidays don't need it to be corrected, since the holidays are about, in a sense, the human being's relationship with God, and are not tied in any particular way to events or harvests that take place in the world. And therefore, so that's a very, very different choice that Islam made than was made by either Judaism or Christianity. So are there any questions before we end for today? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, Paula.
My question is, there's a tradition in Christianity of isolated religious communities like nuns and monks. Is there a tradition of that kind of community in Islam or in Judaism?
Okay, so in Judaism, very, very little. In Judaism, even where you have mystical, you have mystical and spiritualist groups, ultimately, Jewish mysticism is best achieved within the community. And so, and is always tied to the mitzvot. And because there's a very strong idea of minyan, therefore, we don't have hardly any monastic, that's not to say we have none, but there's hardly any monastic tendencies within the Jewish tradition. The only, and I would say the last strong monastic tendencies that existed were actually, I'd say you had the Essenes in antiquity, and then in medieval Europe, in the 11th century, you had a group called the Hasidei Ashkenaz, which were the Hasidim of the Ashkenazic pious ones, having nothing to do with the Hasidim that were created by the Baal Shem Tov. And they were, to a degree, closer to monasticism than any other Jewish group. And they were into all sorts of self-affliction as a way of creating piety. So they were fairly close. In the Islamic world, you have various Sufi groups that are similar in some ways to monasticism, though you don't have the idea of celibacy doesn't enter Judaism or Islam in any significant way. Louis? And then Sam.
On the subject of calendars, there's more than one Christian calendar.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. The Orthodox have a separate calendar, and the reason why the Orthodox have a separate calendar, and there are others as well, is that in the 16th century, I believe, or the 17th, it was the 17th century, the Pope instituted changes in the calendar that better reflected the reality of how the leap years work. And in the Orthodox churches, they didn't accept that. And for other reasons as well, they date Christmas at different times. So that leads to differences. So absolutely, yeah. But all Christian calendars effectively are solar calendars. They just date holidays somewhat different times.
Yeah.
Leslie, and Sam rather, and then Leslie.
Three quick ones. One is that on the topic of similarities between mosques and synagogues, one that I don't think was mentioned was that we don't have human representation, no carvings or anything like that, although maybe stained glass windows or something like that. But in Orthodox synagogues, and I think conservative mostly, there is never anything carved like a human representation, and I think it's the same with in mosques. They have writing, and that's about and maybe geometric decoration. Other comment I wanted to make was that when we were talking about sort of how holidays have developed, I lived for 20 years in the United States, and I was amazed at how much both Halloween and the Super Bowl Sunday have become non-religious, totally crazy national holidays, both of those. And one other comment that I had was, you mentioned that the Kohanim get their hands and the feet washed, and I'm a Kohen, and I've never had my feet washed, so I'd like to know where it is I could go to get my feet washed.
I think more in Spartak synagogues. I want to touch on, so Sam made some important points, but we'll touch on has anybody ever visited the synagogue in Beit Alpha, the synagogue in Sipori, or the synagogue in Hamat Tiberias? These are mosaic floors in Israel that were found in synagogues. Well, if you go to any of those synagogues, and they were important synagogues of their time. All of them date between the 2nd and the 6th century. They all have zodiacs in the floor with actually the god Helios in the center and representations of various prophets and other figures. So so graven images can't be worshipped, but the idea that they can't be in synagogue, and if you go to the Dura Europos synagogue, you'll see even more. So it's not always been the case that synagogues didn't allow for representations of human beings, or even strangely, zodiac figures and Greek gods. So so it's very dangerous to make blanket statements about Judaism. Leslie, and then Odette, and then Louis, and then I think we have to end.
My question just was a quick one, is what was the Muslim equivalent of the Shema or the Creed for
It
the
was
Christians?
the Muslim prayer called the Shahada.
Shahada. Thank you.
Odette?
Okay, so I just wanted to add on, when you have explained about the language of services in different synagogues in the United States, whether it was in the German, apart from Hebrew, obviously, or English as we see it nowadays. We see a little bit of English, but you know, in the Muslim world, wherever the Jews, and are still some of them living, it's only Hebrew. If there is anything added, it will be transliterated in the Judeo language of that country. But also, I think, that is my own conclusion. Of course, the Jews at that time learned Hebrew, whether the boys in the yeshivot, some girls also had yeshivot. They had yeshivot from the 1800s at the time. But because people use Hebrew all the time, by rote, you learned it. You learned, I mean, the main, I'm not saying the whole service, or when the leader will say, there was no page, obviously, there was the Amida or this or that. When he started a new paragraph, everybody knows where that paragraph is. And I thought that is wonderful, but also it's because the community consistently, I mean, that was the meeting place, as you wish.
Okay.
Consistently adopted to go there.
So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Well, and until the 19th century and the rise of the Enlightenment, all Jewish services were done primarily in Hebrew. Although the sermons probably were done in Yiddish, Judeo-Arabic, Ladino, or whatever was the appropriate language. So
Right,
the sermons
right.
were to be understood. Having said that, scholarship has shown that it was only a small number of boys who went to yeshivot. It was not the majority. And there was a functional illiteracy where people could read the Hebrew prayers, but the number of people who necessarily understood them was not particularly higher than today, except for the smaller educated class. So while Hebrew certainly was the norm and was better used in the past, we shouldn't idealize the level of knowledge that people had about Hebrew as a functional language. It wasn't the primary language they spoke, and it wasn't even a language they understood, though it certainly was a language of prayer. So that's an important thing to remember.
But
let's
yes.
let other people have a chance.
Well, you can.
Louis, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that some Israeli friends took Freya and me to see Tzipori. It was very interesting, but I don't think that it's too common a place for tours. But maybe it should be.
It's a beautiful site. So if
Yes.
you can get to the mosaics in Tzipori and the synagogue there, but also the general mosaics of the town are amazing. As are in the synagogue outside of Tiberias, the Hamat Tiberia ruin is a beautiful synagogue. Absolutely. Sharon?
The Beth Shalom has people in the stained glass windows.
Yeah, and that's not it's not common, but it's not technical. As long as you're not worshiping the guy planting the tree, you're safe.
He's too young for me.
It's so the ideas about what's allowed in a synagogue or not have changed over the ages. That's so it's So, so in modern times, we have different values than in other times. And that's how religions grow and change and develop. And as long as, the prohibition is against graven images that are worshipped. So these are not.
It's just people seem to worship these statues of saints. It's been explained to me that's a passage to actually talk to God, but people pray to saints for medical miracles. And apparently any other kind of miracle doesn't work, but there has to be 2 miracles that the saint who isn't a saint yet was prayed to, and then they become saints because of the medical miracles.
Yeah, but I think we have to be careful about, just because the religion is different than ours doesn't make it something that's wrong or strange. So we have to be understand that's how they look at the world, and how they reach God can be in different ways. There are plenty of Jews that pray using the name of angels. There was a long Jewish history of having amulets which had names of God, which allow, so every religion has its different ways of reaching the divine. And I think we have to understand that.
Okay, it's just that the Roman gods seem to have turned into the Roman Catholic saints, and there's a saint for every occasion, or
I think
just
that's
everything.
I think that's not an accurate observation. I think it's looking at. I think when we try to judge other religions based on our norms, and what we think is appropriate and important, then we can only get in trouble, because we're misunderstanding. I think when we talk about and think about how a Catholic looks at a saint, we have to take seriously how theologically they talk about it. Because if we went to Jewish popular religion, it would, from the outside, it would sound equally silly. So, but if you think about theologically how it's talked about, then we can understand really what's going on, even if people misunderstand it or look at it in different ways. That happens with us as much as with any other religion. Paula?
Well, I don't think it's any different than Jews who make pilgrimages to pray at the graves of certain rabbis because they feel that they will have some sort, because the spot, they consider it to be holy. People make pilgrimages for all kinds of reasons, and Jews are not exempt from like magical thinking that a certain location is the only location where God is.
Yeah, as I talked about in North Africa, the Jewish community there had saints literally who they went pilgrimages to see. People still have Baba Sali in their wallets and look at him as and pray not to him, but use it as a lucky thing. How various Hasidic groups look at the Rebbes and go to the Rebbe's tombs. You have how many people are going right now to the tomb of the Lubavitch Rebbe and making offerings there. So, or not offerings, but leaving notes, asking for things. So it's no different. And we have to be careful about how we look at other religions, because ultimately every religion from the outside looks equally silly. It's true. Every religion is built on beliefs, and ultimately, from an outside perspective, there's no religion looks any more rational than any other. It speaks to us, and so we have to think about our religion and how we connect without judging other people's religions. Yeah.
Good point. Excellent.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah. No, we have to end because I have to get ready for Mincha, so I have to get on a Zoom account.
Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi Kunin.
So
say hello to Shelley for us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I have to stop.